Welcome to the crash course in the Queen's Gambit. Today I'd love to share with you 9 main ideas that you need to know in order to play like a pro and to take advantage of your opponent's common mistakes. White begins the Queen's Gambit by playing pawn to c4, offering this Gambit pawn. And the very first mistake of black, which is very common, is to accept the Gambit and to give up their center. Now, what is wrong with black capturing this pawn? I think there is a very common misunderstanding here, so let me explain it straight away. Now, in an opening, generally speaking, you wish to develop pieces, castle, and occupy the center, meaning you want to establish your control over these 4 squares. And by offering this bait on c4, white is trying to drag black out of the center, and if black accepts the gambit, white achieved their mission successfully. Now, black usually does not really recognize that because they think, oh, what's wrong with just capturing a free pawn? And even if white ever gets this pawn back, that will be just an exchange of a pawn for a pawn, like what's wrong with that? But the wrong thing about this is that white will be able to grab the center and to establish their dominance. Also, white can get their pawn back very easily just by playing e3 and getting this pawn right on the next move. So let's say black develops somehow, white grabs the pawn, and now let's play out for a few more moves and we will see how white achieved what they wanted. Let's say black develops and white does the same, and even right here you can already see that white's got a pawn in the center which controls this square. It can always go forward and create some threats, and black has nothing right in the middle of the board. If we look at these 4 squares, black's got nothing, which we can say white successfully outsmarted black in establishing their control, and that is why black should not give up the center. By the way, let me also share one tactical idea here. Quite often your opponents will throw this bishop out of here to g4, trying to pin the knight. And I know that some of you guys will wish to turn it into the real Queen's Gambit by gambiting the queen and going something like this, saying, hey, you want to grab my queen? Go ahead. I'm going to checkmate you with bishop takes f7. And although it's a nice try, in this particular case, it does not work because instead of grabbing the queen, black should grab the knight and only then grab the queen. So instead of knight to e5, how should white handle that situation? I call it the zigzag method. When your opponent goes right, you go left and you take advantage of his weaknesses. So he removed the bishop from the queen side, and now you move the queen right there, targeting this weak pawn on f7, as well as this pawn on b7. From there, you're going to also attack this knight on c6. Black is already defenseless. They're going to lose at least one of their pawns, and if they continue their own attack with bishop takes f3, you're not going to recapture. Instead, you have something a lot better. You just grab this pawn, checking their king. The king must move, and then queen to e6 is a very quick and unexpected checkmate. In the previous example, black suffered for a tactical blunder at the end, and it may not be clear whether accepting the gambit pawn was actually the root cause of their loss or not. And of course, that move does not lose the game straight away. It's just a step in the wrong direction. So let me show you how the game can play out if both sides just play most expected moves. So let's say both sides just develop, black plays safe, white does the same. Now white develops. At this point, black needs to figure out how to develop this bishop because it's blocked by this pawn. So let's say they decide to fianchetto it, and now it is the moment of truth. White can already grab the center and put both pawns right there, establishing control over this white territory, and that is the ideal setup that you'd love to achieve in any opening, basically. Now let's say black goes bishop b7, that also attacks this pawn twice, therefore white needs to defend it, and now black develops somehow. Now if we look at this position, for example, white can go rook d1, putting the rook opposite to the queen. We can already feel that it is a little bit uncomfortable for black, because what can they really do? Like if they ever try to open up the center by going c5, this opposition will be unpleasant. If they move the queen away somewhere, white can go bishop g5 and also put a pin right here, threaten pawn e5. If let's say they guard this bishop, then white can also bring the other rook into play, and we could achieve something like this early in the middle game. And if you look at the position, we can see that white grabs a lot of space, their rooks are active along these files, their bishops are active, controlling a lot of diagonals. White can push the central pawns and begin attacking anytime they want to, while black is actually crawling along the last 2 ranks mainly, and it's really hard for black to move. If you look at their pieces, like this knight just can't really move, all the squares are taken. Right? You can only move backwards, which wouldn't make that much sense anyway. Same thing, this bishop can hardly move and can't do really anything. This knight does not have any active squares to go to. Again, it can only go somewhere to the edge, and it's meaningless anyway. So that is how controlling the center is so advantageous for you, and that is why black should not give up the center. Before we move on to the next one, let me have a quick announcement and invite you to join our team. We are hiring currently a content writer. This is a remote job that you can do from home, and it's full-time. If you're interested, you can get to know all the details by clicking the link in the description below this video, and if you happen to know somebody who might be a good fit, feel free to share it with them, and we also offer a referral bonus to you. The second common misconception about the Queen's Gambit is that it is not actually a gambit, just the naming is a bit misleading. The fact is, if Black accepts this pawn, they cannot really hold on to this pawn, and as we have already seen, White can just play e3 and get this pawn back straight on the next move. There's just no way for Black to hold on to this pawn. If they try bishop e6, that's a little awkward, it's gonna block this pawn, and therefore the bishop, the queen to some extent, and White can still play knight e3, add the second attack to this pawn, and Black is running out of options to defending. If instead of bishop e6 they try to guard this pawn by the other pawn with pawn to b5, there is a classical Queen's Gambit trap where you play pawn a4 aiming to split up these pawns, and if Black happens to do that, you will easily get them back, plus you activate your pieces and get a positional advantage. If instead Black tries to still solidify this pawn chain somehow, like it fails badly. If they play pawn a6, then it temporarily guards the pawn, but after this exchange, what they've missed is that this rook on a8 is actually left undefended. You can just grab it and win the game. And if instead Black decides to guard this pawn on b5 with the other pawn with pawn to c6, then after the exchange, there is this really sneaky move queen to f3, pursuing a very unusual idea to capture the rook in the corner, and Black have to give up material to save their rook. They'll have to give up either the rook or the knight or the bishop anyway. They'll have to give up some major material, which will give you a winning position. In the next example, Black initially played the correct move, pawn e6, solidifying their center. After this, both sides developed their knights, and now Black still gave up the center, the mistake we talked about previously. White plays pawn e3, aiming to get this pawn back, and here Black followed up with another common mistake, knight to c6. And it's very interesting to talk about this move, because for many beginner players, it's very unclear why is the move knight to c6 wrong. Because in most of the other openings, it is the right move to play, suggested to play straight from the beginning of the game. So how come it's wrong? Well, let's talk about this. Again, if we played out a couple more moves, let's say both sides just develop, and White decided to occupy the center with going to pawn e4, what can Black do next? Let's think about that. They wish to develop this bishop somehow, but if they just develop it right here to d7, it will remain to be passive. If they try b6 followed by bishop b7, even there the bishop will also be locked by this knight from c6. Also, in all of these variations, if I take it back, Black would really wish to play pawn to c5 and contest the center, put pressure onto the white center, but this knight stands in the way. And therefore, Black has a hard time untangling their queenside pieces to bring the bishop into play, bring the rook into play, making their queen active, undermining the center, so this frisky knight gets in the way of everyone's feet and hampers Black's movements. So, what was the right way for Black? Instead, Black should give up way to their c-pawn first. They should play pawn c5, strike in the center, and only then bring their knight into play with knight of c6. And now the situation becomes a lot more favorable to Black, because now they're attacking this pawn 3 times, putting strong pressure, although right now White is defending this pawn successfully, but on the other hand, White still needs to guard this pawn all the time. They can't easily push this pawn forward, that'll immediately be a blunder. Also, they can't move their queen away easily. If they ever do that, again, this pawn will be lost, which means that White is tied down to the defense of this pawn. If they ever trade on c5, well, nice for Black, then White will give up their center and the position will become absolutely equal and symmetric. Therefore, Black would equally, achieve a great position. There's also another unknown and very interesting idea that I'd love to share with you. Now, in the classical variation of the Queen's Gambit, we develop knights, and then the most usual move for White is to develop the bishop right here to g5. To this, Black usually responds bishop e7, and we get to the main line of the Queen's Gambit. However, White can actually trick Black a little bit by playing the different move order. Instead of playing bishop g5 straight away, you can first develop your knight, which fundamentally does not change anything because on the next move you're going to play bishop g5 anyway, you just reorder the moves. However, it's a little bit tricky because in this position the most played move by Black is bishop b4, and that is yet another common error. If you're playing this position as Black, I would not recommend that you play bishop b4. I'd say that it's a common beginner error. Now, the bishop b4 move in itself is not wrong. GMs play that as well, but it creates a more imbalanced position where Black is pinning this knight, White is pinning this knight, and overall these are like tricky variations, and ideally you'd wish to know some theory here because it's sharper and more complex. Also, when GMs play this move, they understand the following correct plan, how Black is going to counterattack in the center. However, when beginners play the move bishop to b4, they usually just see that they can pin the knight, looks cool, they bring the bishop out of there, and it looks like an aggressive option. But without proper follow-up, that is just a mistake. Let me show you why. because after this, we can have this bishop g5 pin, and black cannot put their bishop to e7. Well, theoretically, they could drop it back, but they wouldn't. So we have this pin, and black usually doesn't really know how to handle that. While this pin is not a problem, because white is going to castle away on the next moves anyway. So let's say black castles, white goes e3, black develops somehow, white develops, black does something, and white castles away from this pin, automatically neutralizing it. Therefore, this pin has never been a problem, and white successfully castled away. Now, blacks have a hard time justifying this position of a bishop. What is it going to do then? If they ever trade on c3, that would be one more positional error, because bishop, generally speaking, is a little bit stronger than a knight. On top of that, if black forces this trade, that allows white to bring one more piece, one more pawn, I should say, closer to the center of the board, therefore solidifying their center further. And this double pawn is not an issue because white can easily trade it off. And if black ever captures right here on d4, it's really nice for us that we already have this supporting pawn. We can just recapture, and white is already getting a very favorable position. It's, of course, not really winning, but strategically, black is already at a significant disadvantage, and I'd say it's very dangerous because white's got two bishops. They both are powerful. They're controlling like the entire board. White is also controlling the center, having two pawns versus one. White's got these nice files for his rooks that he can put after, playing queen c2 and put in the rooks right there. White is having a very nice active position, and for black, it's going to be really tough to equalize here. Here comes the next idea. Wait till your opponent develops a bishop before you take on c4. Now, what's the point? Well, as we already know, quite often there is no need for black to take on c4 at all. But if you choose to do so, it's better to wait till white moves their bishop because it will force white to lose a tempo. Let's see how it plays out. Black can just play normal development moves, white will do the same. Black can castle. After this, black can develop their knight. They can also develop their queenside bishop if they want to, and they're waiting for white to develop this bishop. Sooner or later, white will need to make the move of this bishop because they need to castle, they need to complete their development, and as soon as white moves the bishop, only then it makes sense for black to actually go ahead and capture this pawn, because now white brought their bishop to c4 in two moves instead of developing it in one go straight from the starting position, which means that black won a tempo, and it's nice for black. The next question people often face is at some point black usually goes pawn c5, especially if they know that they should counter the center with this pawn, and then at some point they're going to capture on d4. And the question would be, should you recapture by your queen, a pawn, or a knight? Which one is correct? What do you think? Well, all three are possible, but taking with the queen is not really a good option because after queens come off the board, the position becomes more or less equal and it's hard to play for a win, it's hard to attack, therefore I would not recommend this one. Therefore, we're left with either pawn takes or knight takes, and both of them are perfectly playable. They just lead to slightly different type of positions. If you capture with a knight, then the position remains to be symmetric. If you look at the pawn structure, it is exactly symmetric for white and black. Therefore, we're going to expect slower, more maneuvering positional game, and actually this trade on d4 was quite in the white's favor because it only helped white to reposition their knight to a stronger central square. Now, if instead white captures this pawn with their own pawn from e3 to d4, then there is a little bit of a change in the position. White now has this isolated pawn on d4, which cannot be guarded by any pawns from the adjacent files due to their absence. And sometimes in the long run, black can put pressure to this pawn with their knight, a queen, and maybe even a rook down the line. However, of course, white has certain advantages as well. One of them being with the fact that now they have this semi-open file for their rook, which is very nice. They can place their rook actively and easily. And secondly, this bishop is no longer obstructed by the pawn on e3, which allows white to develop their bishop to either g5 or f4 to one of these active positions. Therefore, white is getting some sort of a trade-off. They're having one pawn which is possibly a little bit weak. However, they're getting very active position for their pieces, and generally it's a nice situation for white, and you can definitely go for it. The next idea which black should be aware of is advanced fianchetto, and that is usually a great idea for black in the queen's gambit. Now let's think about this position. Black needs to develop this light square bishop. How can they do this? Well, the first idea that comes to mind is just playing pawn b6 followed by bishop b7. And that is a perfectly fine way. Black certainly may go there, and that is an alright thing. However, if you look at the black's position overall, you can see that, with the exception of this one stallion, the remaining pieces of black are just crawling on the last two ranks, and it's a little bit passive and a little bit defensive. Therefore, if black wishes to be more aggressive and they wish to expand, they can take another approach. Instead of going pawn to b6, they can go for the so-called advanced fianchetto. So here's how they do this. They first trade on c4, and as we know, it is okay to do that after white has already moved their bishop, so that white is forced to lose time. And now they play a6, so that on the next move, after white, let's say, castles, they're going not pawn to b6, but more aggressively pawn to b5. And they're gaining one more tempo, attacking the bishop, forcing the bishop to waste time once again. And after the bishop moves, now black develops this bishop to an active diagonal, and it indeed stands perfectly well here. However, black also managed to bring their pawns of the queen side a little bit further ahead, and it gives them more space. Also, in some variations, black will be able to push b4 and to attack this knight from c3, and overall it gives them freedom of maneuver. Let's say white plays something rook c1, black goes pawn c5. And the fact that this pawn is on b5, not on b6, actually makes black's life easier. This square is pretty handy. They can move their knight there, and from there they can move it forward, or they can develop their queen right there. Overall, it just gives black more space. Potentially, they can even expand on the queen side somehow with c4 or b4. They have more aggressive ideas here. And overall, that's just a nice setup, and black successfully achieved a great position. This brings us to the next point. So far, we've been talking about minor pieces mostly, but how about the rooks? In the Queen's Gambit, it is best for both sides to bring their rooks to the C file and to the D file, because these are the files which are either already opened or we expect them to be opened pretty soon. We can see that these tension, therefore it is quite likely that at some point these two pawns will be traded off, and then these both files will become open. And therefore it is prudent for white and for black to put their rooks there. So white has already placed rook to c1, and then they can play queen e2, vacating this square for the other one. And black can actually do the same. They can play rook c8, bring in this rook to the open file, and after white goes rook d1, which also creates this little bit unpleasant opposition of the rook opposite to the queen. Black can move the queen away and then bring the other rook into play with rook to d8. And this is how the Queen's Gambit played on high level, where both sides play everything right. On a side note, you may notice that it is possible to play pretty high-level chess without memorizing a ton of opening variations, without calculating variations, without diving into tactics too much, just by understanding proper positional principles and following them, because chess inherently is a strategic game, and that is the main way for you to improve at chess. So if you're interested in that, I've created a course designed especially for adult amateurs who don't have much time to study chess, but just want to get most fundamental, most important concepts in one place where they can follow them and bring their chess to the next level. If you're curious, I'll leave a link below the video in the description. The course is called Level Up Your Chess. You can check it out, and if you're interested, I'll be happy to help you. Back in the day, the second world champ came up with the so-called Lasker defense, named after Lasker. He first played pawn h6, and after white drops the bishop back, he then goes knight e4. The move, which initially looks a bit controversial because classical opening tutorials suggest that you should not move the same piece twice in an opening, and that is exactly what black did. So what is the point of that idea? Well, the thing here is that there is another rule which states that when you're lacking space, it's good to trade off some pieces. Think about this. If you look at this area, black's got a number of pieces on this little territory, which makes it a little bit awkward for them to move around. It's kind of like you have 4 people in a 1-bedroom apartment. And therefore, black would wish to get rid of some of them so that it feels freer after that. And that is how he goes knight e4, which forces the exchange of the bishops and also quite likely the knights within the next couple moves. Also, it's nice for black that in most cases white does not know how to handle that, and they usually take on e4, which is wrong. Now, the right approach for white is usually just to ignore it and develop. Also, white could play rook to c1, saying, hey, if you want to trade right here, good, I'll activate my rook and put it to this active position. And after this, white just plays their standard opening moves, bishop d3, castles, and they're enjoying a good game, and white is probably slightly better, although it's more or less equal. However, in most cases, on amateur level, white actually grabs this knight on e4, which is wrong. Now, the real OGs know that to take is a mistake, and the idea being that when you release the tension for no reason, that only helps the opponent to move forward and to make their position more active. And that is exactly what's going on right here. A trade of a knight for knight does not give white any benefits, however, it helps black to move this pawn forward and to attack your knight, forcing it to move away, which is another little accomplishment of black. After the knight goes back, yes, it hits this pawn, however, black has a simple way to guard it, pawn 5, and also a more aggressive way. They can actually kind of take over the initiative by going pawn to e5 and striking in the center, which also sets a clever trap along the way. At first, it looks like white can actually grab this pawn, and after black recaptures, it may feel dangerous because black is putting pressure, but white thinks to himself, hey, wait a second, I can just grab this pawn with my queen, and I'm up a pawn. I'm also guarding this knight, everything's cool. But it's not, because after rook to d8, the queen has to go, and after the queen moves anywhere, then this knight is left undefended, black can just grab it, ending up with an extra piece and a more active position. Of course, white could play better. White shouldn't take this pawn on e4, they should play pawn to d5 and keep the position locked. Now black needs to guard this pawn, so let's say they go pawn f5, and although the position remains to be more or less equal, nevertheless it feels like black is taken over. Maybe they can play knight to c5, or maybe pawn a5 first to take away this square so that the pawn can't move forward, and then on the next move, let's say knight to c5, and then bishop to d7, and thanks to these active pawns, at some point later in the game, black will be able to maybe push them forward and initiate the attack, and white already needs to be careful. It's kind of like white is now fighting for equality. Let me remind you real quick that if you wish to join the Remote Chess Academy and work with me and my team as a content writer, you can click the link in the description below this video and get to know all the details. If you wish me to help you to achieve your chess goals, feel free to head to the course Level Up Your Chess. The link will also be down below in the description. Either way, have a great rest of the day, and I'll talk to you soon.